intended to record this video months ago, but the subject matter was just too close to home, and interest in the Watts case was a little too heated. But it's that very closeness to the case that is the most motivation for the video on these crimes and their cluster B psychiatric roots. I don't feel any of these cases has really received a truly accurate portrayal of cluster B narcissism. After believing I could return to the emotionally intense subject matter, I then decided to break down the three cases into separate sections, beginning with hopefully the least emotive, the call. Something which differed in each case but revealed important information, apparently pointing to guilt. Acknowledging that Peterson and even Coleman have an innocence project-style campaign for each, in the next section I'll look at public scrutiny of the perpetrators and we'll factor in some possibility later on of their potential innocence. With Coleman and Peterson, we can say that to ascertain innocence is to accept a personality profile and set of circumstances that make both men extremely unfortunate, to put it mildly. Back to the call, and in each crime there is a call that sets up the narrative, or in Watts' case, completely destroys his narrative and indicates lack of criminal genius. In terms of Coleman's potential innocence, his call appeared to be a massively clumsy attempt to set up an alibi. In Peterson's case, I'm going to compare the in quotes missing narrative to the way the narrative was set up by Michelle Carter in the Conrad Roy case. Both had personal reasons for needing someone dead to fit a story they had already created beforehand. Similarly, in the Coleman case, which had a background narrative he was desperate to prove true, there was a key call from Tyra Lintz, the woman he was having an affair with. This call would make it again statistically incredible for his family's death to occur so soon after it. In fact, all three cases involved a similar deadline. We'll cover all of this next. So let's begin in a more conventional crime documentary sense by setting up the context of each call. When Chris Coleman's neighbour Justin Barlow received a call from Coleman at 6:45 a.m. on May the 5th, 2009, Coleman had already spent 6 months setting up a viable alternate suspect for the crime. Why? Well, at least in part because news of his marriage difficulties had filtered through to his employer, Joyce Myers Ministries, and he felt certain that if he divorced his wife and/or was discovered to have left his wife for his mistress, then he would lose his six-figure security role salary. This is not in fact the only crime story in which the religious and moral issues attached to divorce led to murder. It seems fairly likely that not only did Coleman feel more psychologically confident about a scenario in which his wife filed for divorce, but that he actively tried to push her into this by being a complete a-hole over a long period of time. This led to the fateful exchange in which his wife Sherry insisted she would never divorce him and asked speculatively what he would do, kill her? Due to his consequent planning then, Coleman is the only one of the three to put in this much effort and therefore would regard him as going above and beyond in terms of premeditation. Using his work computer, which again displays a lack of criminal genius, he had begun faking death threats to himself back in November 2008. He tried to escalate this in January 2009 with notes he faked and claimed were left in his mailbox by a masked man. Coleman was at least a little cunning in involving his neighbour Barlow, both in appealing to his protective nature as a police sergeant and also to the camaraderie Coleman believed he shared by having a similar career in security. As it is, like the Watts case, having his neighbour track a security camera on his home was a bad decision, as it proved later there was no masked stalker at all. One of the suspicious things about Coleman's call was that he had called his neighbour so early to do a welfare check on his family when he himself was only minutes away. He claimed his wife wasn't answering her phone, but he also claimed he decided not to wake her himself when he left the house, but instead tried to wake her by phone after he left. We could consider Coleman and Watts opposites in this approach to the crime. I don't think either set of murders is more chilling, but Watts' desire to just ignore / avoid scrutiny for as long as possible is perhaps more understandable than Coleman's calculations on how to ensure another person found the bodies. Do I think Watts was thinking about the trauma of officers finding his kids in oil wells? No, because he didn't intend or he didn't want people to find the bodies. Coleman's intent was for his neighbour to find his strangled wife and kids, a woman and 2 children Justin Barlow knew personally. As it was, Coleman had perfectly set up a potential threat in Barlow's mind when he called him that morning. As a result, Barlow called his station for backup and they sent Sergeant Jason Donjon, who took around 10 minutes to get there. Again, Coleman's absence at the scene was suspicious, as Barlow had last heard from him when he claimed to be on the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, which was only 7 minutes away at normal speeds. The central problem for Coleman later, in trying to establish a partial alibi and or distancing himself from the crime scene, was that the forensics did not support the narrative that the family died that morning after he left, based on evidence of rigor mortis. Probability-wise then, in ascertaining Coleman's guilt, we should look at it this way. When he called his neighbour on the early morning of May the 5th, it was only hours since his deadline phone call with his fiancée, in quotes, on the side, Tara Lintz, a deadline for the serving of divorce papers to his wife. Divorce papers that did not even exist. For Watts, all of the evidence from my position demonstrates that unlike Coleman, he had not planned this well at all. This was perhaps partially mirrored by the more abstract, creeping nature of his own personal and financial problems. We cannot know for certain, something I will reflect on later, the truth of Watts' statements and what I feel is a similar exchange he had with Shanann the morning she died. At times it did sound as if he snapped rather than progressively plotted, but then again he admits to a foreshadowed, preemptive feeling that something dark would occur that day. My only reason for accepting some of the tale, putting aside the later story the police suggested to him as a psychological tactic of easing him into the truth, and that is that of Shanann as child murderer, was that his account seems messy and therefore possibly realistic. The potential exchange I'm talking about was that involving his confession of an affair and his sitting on her. If she did make this threat about not seeing the kids, then we possibly have a tipping of the scales. We know that predominantly Coleman had in his mind this looming threat of losing a 6-figure salary while trying to romance a woman who clearly valued his earnings. With Watts, he was well aware that divorce on top of the family's debts was not a great start for his new life with mistress Nicole Kessinger. Not seeing his kids on top of this might have tipped the scales. It does not seem as likely that Watts was setting up an alternate suspect for his family's murder with the involvement of his neighbour and his security camera. If that was the case, then that neighbour's involvement not only proved the family could only have left suspiciously in Watts' truck, but also led to the exchange in which a police officer was first alerted by the neighbour's keen instincts to Watts' guilt. Now, if Watts in fact planned all of this as it occurred, it's difficult to see why he would call the Primrose School on 8:15 a.m. Monday, August the 13th, hours before he was supposed to know his family was missing. This call in itself seems to indicate a mild panic in which he could not even form a coherent narrative in a single phone conversation. When he first calls the school, he tells one of their employees that he's calling to notify the school that his children would no longer be attending. Damning as well was his statement to them that his family was moving, but he then appears to spontaneously decide to set up a missing narrative by asking this same employee if his children are in fact there at the school right at that moment. The comment about moving is completely in line with his call later that day to a realtor about selling the house. But it's inconceivable how he thought this was good timing to avert suspicion from him when he was supposed to be a worried spouse and father. On the same Monday morning, Nicole Atkinson is already worried about her best friend Shanann Watts. This is yet another variable that Watts appeared not to have anticipated, being as he was an avoidant killer who appeared to be trying to bury the experience of the murders and move straight on to a new life with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger. Watts did not factor in how active and pro-social his wife was. She was always on the phone and in communication with friends or colleagues. It was so strange for Shanann not to respond to calls or texts that Atkinson was concerned much sooner than Chris might have expected. It also seems likely that in the intensity of his psychotic rage as he reported it, and in the aftermath, he completely forgot that his wife was due to see a doctor about the pregnancy early that day. After many unanswered calls and texts, Nicole Atkinson went straight over to her best friend's home to see for herself if there was any sign of Shanann there. I can only imagine complete panic from Watts when Atkinson called him to say there was no answer and Nicole's car was still there. Something else Watts appeared not to factor in. He could have in fact conceivably driven a short trip to somewhere secluded with that car, perhaps masked to set up a fake perpetrator for the security camera. Then out of sight of the security camera, later transferred everyone to a vehicle without GPS tracking. Again, apparently spontaneous and likely in panic, Chris creates another narrative to fob Nicole off, claiming they're at a play date. Unluckily for Watts, he tells Atkinson to wait for him before she calls police, but she calls them anyway. As a result of that call, at 1:42 p.m. that day, Frederick police officer Scott Coonra arrives at the address where Atkinson and her son are waiting, and she alerts the officer to a detail a female friend would definitely notice. The shoes Shanann always wears are visible by the door. Not expecting either Atkinson or Coonra by this point in the day, at 2 p.m. Chris arrived to let them in. As another indicator of lack of planning and a likely expectation he would have had much longer before police involvement, he ran into the house before the officer and did not open the front door for a couple of minutes. It appears he was trying to think on his feet and moved potential evidence. Perhaps reflecting Scott Peterson's personality, his calls were a little different. Like Watson Coleman, when he made the first call, he had clearly been ruminating on the prospects for a new romance with a mistress and financial problems in the background. In his case, loss of his wife's small salary for some time due to motherhood and new cost of a baby he was notoriously against the idea of, will likely send him in dark directions. The defence claimed he's not calling to cash in on the large life insurance policy he had for his wife was evidence of his innocence, but I just see this as evidence of his not being a complete imbecile. He first made calls to his wife's phone, or claimed he did, when reportedly there was only one, during what he told police was his trip back from the marina on Christmas Eve 2002. And now this is a type of call that's not rare, and not a rare phenomenon in such a murder case. He could have done as Coleman did and asked his in-laws to go check on Lacey at their home. He would not have had to bear the knowledge that they would find any sort of gruesome scene, as in the Coleman case. He would, however, have had to ask his in-laws to do this in the knowledge that Lacey was already dead and dumped unceremoniously in the sea. He neither planned for anyone to find the body of his heavily pregnant wife, nor did he try to delay the discovery of a potential crime by failing to alert people to the missing Lacey Peterson. He could have conceivably waited until the point on which the married couple were late for a meal with their in-laws on that Christmas Eve in 2002 and then called to say could not find Lacey, maybe then warranting the missing statement. As it is, many would ask, including police and prosecution, why he'd wait an hour or more at the time of the 5:15 call and not make a call immediately after he found that his wife was not at their home, with their dog wandering in the backyard. This is the likely reason Peterson did not wait longer to make the call, with an understanding that the longer he waited, the more questions would be asked. I just think the word missing in Lacey's missing, the words he used when calling his mother-in-law that day, was a little preemptive when he had only been home an hour. As it is, I'd say it's entirely in the remit of Peterson's personality that he left it to someone else, Lacey's stepfather Ron Gransky, to call the Modesto Police Department about her family's worries for her safety. I think Scott was aware that with Lacey heavily pregnant and Christmas coming the next day, he could not form any convincing narrative that she left town voluntarily. I think Watts' attempts at a narrative to this effect were just the result of panic and lack of criminal genius. all of the context of the Peterson call has routinely been called odd by commentators and later crime journalists. From the perspective of the Innocence Project, which I think I have to address later in this series of videos, they could argue that it took an hour of searching for Scott to become worried, and that this worry led him to use the word missing. And again, astute observers have pointed out that this term fits rather too well with the narrative Peterson clearly wanted to convey to the mistress the prosecution discovered later, Amber Fry. Peterson did not want to continue his ongoing seduction of Fry with the news, "My wife is suspected as a victim of kidnap and murder." No, he wanted to establish her as the more benign and uncertain missing. In conclusion, in later audio recordings made during police surveillance, Peterson found it difficult to explain to Fry how his wife was missing months after he told Fry he was widowed. Again, a massive coincidence. As I've already noted, Michelle Carter likely believed Conrad Roy would eventually commit suicide and provide her with the victimhood of social capital she ultimately craved. But she had already claimed he was missing days before he in fact was. She therefore had a psychological deadline she was desperate to meet. Peterson would appear to have been, in a cluster B sense, in the early stages of infatuation with Amber Fry. As I will explain, the early infatuation with a new lover necessarily leads to the splitting devaluation of the old partner and a greater craving, almost addictive, for the presence of the new love interest. We can see this as a central factor in all three cases. In all cases, there was the added weight of a deadline. Peterson had already told Fry he was widowed and appears to have wanted to spend all of his time with Fry, and couldn't see himself murdering, of course, a delivered baby. Coleman had faked the idea of divorce papers, and his lover was ramping up the pressure and would find out. And this was only hours before his wife and children died that she called him, with, I'm assuming, ultimatums. Watts had told Kessinger he would divorce, move out, and had mounting bills and commitments, especially had he allowed the birth of his impending baby, Nico. These calls reveal extreme amounts of planning at the Coleman end of the spectrum, and chaotic thinking on the Watts end. Peterson falls somewhere in the middle, but all three had become increasingly desperate.